blood drained from Sophie. slowly rose from his chair, walked around the massive desk, and knelt down to meet her at eye level. "You want to work for me?" "Yes, sir," she whispered. "I'll do whatever you need." "Why choose me?" "Because people say you can fix the impossible," Ruby said softly. "Maybe you can fix my mum too." Lachlan's throat went dry. It had been years since anyone had looked at him with that kind of raw faith. Images flashed through his mind of his own child, one he'd lost contact with long ago, around this very age. He reached out carefully and took the paper from Ruby's small hand. "Come with me," he said at last. Madison's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir, are you certain?" Lachlan didn't respond. He simply took the little girl's hand and led her out of the office. The corridor buzzed with shocked whispers as the billionaire who rarely even smiled walked past holding a child's hand. Phone cameras turned. Staff members froze mid-conversation. Lachlan ignored every single one. Outside, he opened the door of his sleek black Range Rover. "Get in," he said gently. Ruby hesitated for just a moment before climbing inside, her legs dangling off the leather seat. As the city blurred past through tinted windows, Lachlan stared down at the drawing still in his grip. Something deep inside him was beginning to crack wide open. "What's your mother's name?" he asked quietly. "Sophie Bennett," Ruby answered. "She never complains even when she's in pain. But the nurse said she won't make it if we don't settle the bills." Lachlan's jaw clenched hard. "Then we'll settle them." When they arrived at Royal North Shore Hospital, the nurse's expressions shifted to shock. "Mr. Hayes, sir, what brings you here? Which room is she in?" he demanded. Within moments, he stood at the foot of Sophie's hospital bed. The woman looked frail, her skin pale as porcelain. Ruby rushed to her side, tears streaming down her face. "Mom, I found someone. He promised he'll help us." Sophie struggled to sit up, confusion written across her face. "Sir, forgive me. I don't understand any of this." "You don't need to understand," Ethan said firmly. "Just focus on getting well." He turned toward the nurse. "What's the outstanding amount?" $68,000, sir," she stammered. Lachlan pulled out his mobile. "Send me the payment details immediately, and transfer her to a private suite." The nurse blinked rapidly. "Are you family?" "No," Lachlan said, his tone cutting. "I'm the person who's ensuring she survives." The room went completely still. Ruby clung to her mother's arm, whispering through her tears. "See, Mom, I told you he could fix anything." For a long stretch, Lachlan couldn't find words. Watching the little girl's desperate hope stirred something he hadn't felt in years. Perhaps warmth, perhaps purpose. That evening, as he stood outside the hospital watching the Sydney skyline light up behind him, Lachlan tilted his head back toward the darkening sky and muttered under his breath, "What are you doing to me, kid?" And for the first time in what felt like forever, the cold-hearted tycoon allowed himself to smile. The next morning, Hayes Empire Group headquarters erupted like a hive someone had kicked over. Gossip flew from department to department at lightning speed. Everyone was talking about the barefoot girl who'd somehow walked into Lachlan Hayes' office and emerged holding his hand like they'd known each other forever. Some speculated she was a long-lost niece. Others suggested it was all an elaborate PR move. But nobody could make sense of why the billionaire notorious for terminating senior managers over minor errors had suddenly gone soft. At precisely 9:15, the lift doors opened and every single head swiveled. There she was, Ruby Bennett, no longer barefoot but dressed in a crisp lavender dress that Madison Cooper had purchased for her the night before. Her hair was brushed into 2 neat ponytails, her smile timid but glowing. And standing beside her was Lachlan Hayes himself, impeccable in his navy suit, holding her tiny hand as though it were spun from gold. The entire reception area fell silent. Lachlan stopped in the center of the lobby and spoke loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear. "This is Ruby. She's my assistant now. Anyone who treats her with anything less than respect is treating me with disrespect." The crowd remained frozen. People exchanged bewildered glances. The billionaire who'd never been seen smiling had just publicly defended a 7-year-old child. Inside his office, Lachlan set up a small desk near the window overlooking the harbor. On it, he placed colored pencils, drawing paper, and bottles of apple juice. That's your workspace, he said. You'll be helping me with critical matters. Ruby beamed. Like what? He smiled faintly, like reminding me I'm not a machine. Madison watched from the doorway, her eyes glistening. She'd been working for Lachlan for nearly a decade and had never once heard him crack a joke, let alone laugh. That afternoon, Lachlan hosted a crucial meeting with international investors. Tensions ran high. Hundreds of millions hung in the balance. Ruby sat quietly at her little desk, coloring in silence. The executives barely registered her presence until one investor leaned back in his chair, revealing a small coffee stain on his crisp white shirt. Ruby stood up, walked over to him, and whispered gently, "Excuse me, sir, you've got a stain on your shirt." The room froze. The man glanced down, embarrassed at first, then broke into laughter. "Well, I suppose I could use an assistant like this one." The entire table erupted into chuckles. Even Lachlan allowed himself a rare grin. By the time the meeting wrapped, the investors were relaxed, even jovial. The deal was secured. Madison leaned toward Lachlan as everyone filed out. "You do realize that little girl just saved a $300 million contract, don't you?" He didn't answer directly, but his lips curved ever so slightly. "Remind me to increase her salary." But not everyone was pleased. Watching from the glass-lined corridor was Isabella Frost, one of Lachlan's most senior vice presidents. Elegant, ambitious, and feared by nearly everyone in the company, Isabella had spent years building her reputation as Lachlan's most loyal executive, and in secret she'd loved him. She'd waited patiently for him to notice her, to say her name the way he now said Ruby's. That afternoon, Isabella stormed into Declan Shaw's office, slamming the door behind her. "Have you seen him lately?" she snapped. "He's sitting there coloring with a street kid while the company practically runs itself." Declan raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Isabella. The man seems different these days. Happier, even. Happier?" She scoffed bitterly. "With some orphan? He's losing his grip." Declan hesitated before responding. "Perhaps he's finally finding his heart." Isabella's eyes hardened like ice. "Then I'll make sure he remembers who he really is." Later that week, she hired 2 private investigators, slipping them cash under the table. "Dig up everything on that little girl and her so-called mother," she ordered coldly. "Where they live, who they really are, every last detail." While Isabella's jealousy festered in the shadows, Lachlan's connection with Ruby continued to deepen. Each day she came to the office, her laughter seemed to fill every corner. She brought him coffee made all wrong, too much milk, not nearly enough sugar, but he drank it without complaint. She sketched little drawings and left them on his desk, tiny pictures of him, her, and Mum holding hands. One afternoon, Ruby approached him shyly. "Mr. Lachlan?" "Yes, Ruby? Can we go visit Mum? She keeps asking if you're actually real." He smiled warmly. "Let's go prove to her that I am." At Royal North Shore Hospital, Sophie Bennett was sitting upright now, color returning to her cheeks. When Lachlan entered the room with Ruby skipping happily beside him, Sophie tried to stand. "Please, sir," she said, her voice shaking. "You've already done far too much for us." Lachlan shook his head firmly. "If anyone deserves help, it's the woman who raised this extraordinary little soul." Ruby proudly handed her mother one of her latest drawings. "Mum, look. That's me and Mr. Lachlan at his office. He lets me draw next to the big harbor window." Sophie smiled through her tears, overwhelmed. "You're far too kind, Mr. Hayes. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Then don't try," he said gently. "Just focus on recovering." Before leaving, he placed a sealed envelope on her bedside table. Sophie gasped when she opened it, finding a check large enough to cover not just her treatment but an entirely new beginning. "Why would you do this?" she whispered, stunned. Lachlan glanced at Ruby, then back at Sophie. "Because she believes I can fix the impossible. I suppose it's time I started living up to that." That night, as his car glided smoothly through Sydney's glowing streets, Lachlan's reflection stared back at him in the tinted glass. He wasn't entirely sure who he was becoming anymore. A businessman? A protector? Or perhaps just a man rediscovering what it meant to truly feel something. But across the city, Isabella Frost stood in her luxury penthouse apartment, reviewing the report her investigators had just delivered. Her pulse quickened as she flipped through the photographs. Sophie and Ruby outside a rundown flat in Parramatta. Smile crept across her face. So the perfect little angel isn't even hers biologically. She picked up her phone and dialed. "Let's make this front page news," she said coldly. "Something that'll destroy them both and remind Lachlan Hayes exactly who he is." At that very moment, unaware of the storm gathering around her, Ruby drifted off to sleep at home with her pencil set tucked under her pillow. And Lachlan, gazing out at the night sky from his harbourside penthouse, whispered to himself, "Why does it feel like I've known her my entire life?" He had absolutely no idea that the answer would shatter and rebuild everything he thought he knew. If you were Lachlan, would you protect Ruby no matter the cost? Do you think Isabella will stop at exposing secrets or push even further? And what hidden connection do you believe ties Lachlan and Ruby together? The following morning, chaos tore through Sydney's media landscape like a bushfire. Headlines screamed from every screen. Billionaire Lachlan Hayes caught in child scam. Photos of Ruby feeding her sick mother in hospital flooded social media, accompanied by brutal accusations that the little girl wasn't Sophie's biological daughter at all, but an abandoned orphan Sophie had taken in years earlier. The press painted it as an elaborate sympathy con. The internet exploded, mocking Lachlan's compassion as naivety. At Hayes Empire Group, tension hung thick as storm clouds. Journalists camped outside the glass tower while employees whispered nervously in break rooms. Lachlan arrived looking calm on the surface but seething underneath, his eyes sharp as broken glass. He stormed into Madison Cooper's office, gripping a tablet displaying the damaging article. "Who leaked this?" he demanded. Madison's face went pale as milk. "I honestly don't know, sir, but whoever did it had access to hospital records and sealed documents." Lachlan's expression didn't shift. "Then I already know exactly who's responsible." Moments later, the lift to Isabella Frost's executive suite opened with a sharp ding. She glanced up just in time to see Lachlan slam the tablet onto her polished desk. "You did this," he said quietly, his voice dangerously controlled. Isabella didn't even flinch. "People deserve to know the truth, Lachlan. That woman deceived you. That girl isn't hers. You were being manipulated." Lachlan leaned forward slowly. "You think exposing the truth gives you permission to ruin a child's life? She's not your responsibility," Isabella hissed. "She's a mistake someone abandoned." That was the breaking point. Lachlan's fist slammed down on her desk, his voice rising like thunder. "Don't you dare call her that ever again." Isabella froze, her breath catching. She'd never seen him this furious in all the years she'd known him. "If I discover you orchestrated this leak," Lachlan continued icily, "you won't just lose your position here. You'll lose every shred of credibility you've ever built in this city." He turned sharply and left, the door slamming so hard the glass walls rattled. That night, Lachlan drove alone through Sydney streets, his mind spinning out of control. Questions he'd buried for years clawed their way back to the surface. Sophie had told him she found Ruby abandoned as an infant 7 years ago behind a loading dock near the Sapphire Crown Hotel. He remembered that night long ago, after his company had closed a massive international merger. His colleagues had dragged him out to celebrate at the Sapphire Crown's rooftop bar. He'd been drinking heavily, toasting their success, when everything started to blur. Music pounding, lights spinning, laughter that didn't feel real. The next morning, he'd woken up in an unfamiliar hotel room beside a woman he couldn't remember, feeling confused and deeply ashamed. He'd never spoken about it to anyone. Now his chest felt like it was being crushed. Could there be a connection? He pressed harder on the accelerator, speeding toward the modest flat where Sophie and Ruby lived. When he knocked, Sophie's eyes widened in alarm. "Mr. Hayes, is something wrong?" "I need to ask you something," Lachlan said softly, his voice cracking. "The night you found Ruby, where exactly was it?" "Behind an old loading bay," Sophie replied slowly, her eyes distant with memory. "Near the Sapphire Crown Hotel." She was crying in the freezing cold, wrapped in a torn blanket. There was a note with her, Lachlan's heart hammered so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. A note? Sophie nodded, reaching into an old shoebox tucked in her wardrobe. The paper was yellowed and fragile, the handwriting shaky and desperate. I'm ill. I can't care for her. She was born from a mistake I regret. Please, whoever finds her, love her the way I cannot. Forgive me. The words swam before Lachlan's eyes. His knees nearly buckled beneath him. That hotel. That night. Oh God. Sophie frowned, concerned. Mr. Hayes, are you all right? He looked up at her, his eyes brimming with tears and realization. She's not your blood, Sophie. She's mine. Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What are you saying? Lachlan gripped the note, trembling. 7 years ago, I was drugged at a party. I woke up next to a woman I never saw again. She must have been Ruby's mother. For what felt like an eternity, silence pressed down on the tiny flat. Then Sophie's voice came out in a broken whisper. You're telling me you're her father? Lachlan nodded slowly, tears spilling freely down his face. I had no idea until now, but I know it in my bones, and I swear I will never let her go again. From the doorway of the bedroom, a tiny voice whispered shakily, Daddy? Ruby stood there in her pajamas, clutching her coloring book, eyes wide with confusion and hope. Lachlan turned, tears streaming. He dropped to his knees, opening his arms wide. Yes, sweetheart, he said, his voice breaking. It's me. I'm your dad. Ruby blinked, processing the impossible, then ran straight into his arms, sobbing. You're really my daddy? For real, not pretend? For real, not pretend, he whispered, holding her tighter than he'd ever held anyone. And I promise I'm never leaving you again. Behind them, Sophie covered her face with both hands, crying silently. Oh God, thank you, she whispered through her tears. The following morning, Lachlan called an emergency press conference. Every journalist, employee, critic, and curious onlooker packed into the grand auditorium of Harbor Point Tower. When Lachlan walked in holding Ruby's hand, the entire room fell into stunned silence. He stood before the cameras, his voice steady but charged with emotion. You've all read the headlines. You've seen the lies spread across your screens. But here's the actual truth. He looked down at Ruby and smiled through his tears. This little girl isn't just someone I chose to help out of kindness. She's my daughter, my own flesh and blood. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Lachlan's voice grew stronger. She walked into my office a month ago asking for work, not realizing she was actually giving me back my life. I spent years believing I had it all. Wealth, influence, power. But I had nothing that mattered until I found her. The auditorium erupted into thunderous applause. Even the most hardened reporters couldn't hide the tears in their eyes. Cameras flashed as Lachlan bent down and wrapped Ruby in a tight embrace. If you ever doubt that miracles exist, he said softly into the microphones, just look at her. Afterwards, Isabella Frost quietly slipped out of the hall, shame burning through her like fire. That evening, she arrived at Sophie and Ruby's flat, tears streaming down her face unchecked. I'm so deeply sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I hurt you both because I was jealous and bitter. I forgot what it meant to be human. Ruby looked up at her with those impossibly innocent eyes. It's okay, she said gently. Dad says forgiving people makes your heart feel lighter. Isabella broke down completely, kneeling to hug the child. You're absolutely right, sweetheart. Thank you for teaching me that. A week later, Lachlan made another public announcement. In front of the entire company and national media, he handed Sophie the keys to a beautiful home in Mossman overlooking the harbor and officially appointed her as director of the Ruby Foundation for Children, dedicated to helping abandoned and vulnerable kids just like Ruby once was. As for Lachlan, his evenings were no longer spent alone in a cold, empty penthouse. Instead, they were filled with laughter, crayon drawings scattered everywhere, and the comforting smell of home-cooked meals wafting through the house. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant orange streaks over Sydney Harbor, Lachlan stood in the backyard watching Ruby chase fireflies while Sophie set the outdoor table for dinner. She turned toward him, smiling warmly. You look at peace. He nodded slowly, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. For the first time in my life, I actually am. Ruby ran toward him, laughing breathlessly. Dad, look, caught one. Lachlan scooped her up effortlessly, spinning her around in the fading light. You caught far more than a firefly, sweetheart. He whispered into her hair. You caught my heart and gave me a reason to live. That night, as stars began to appear over their home, Lachlan glanced at Sophie and Ruby, his family, and whispered a silent prayer of thanks into the universe. Because sometimes destiny doesn't just find you randomly. Sometimes it walks barefoot into your office and calls you home. Thanks for watching. We genuinely hope you'll help us create even better content moving forward. How did the story make you feel? Do you believe fate can reunite families that were meant to be together? If the story touched something deep inside